Welcome to The Chat. Come behind the inbound scenes of some of the world's fastest growing companies. For the past 10 years as Chatmetrics, we've had an exclusive inside view of how these industry leaders are revolutionising inbound marketing and sales across diverse sectors. Each week, we bring you conversations with top minds in marketing and sales who share insider secrets and strategies for driving inbound success. Join us on The Chat, your front row seat to the future of inbound. Getting that feedback from the customers that say no and understanding, again, that's where the gold is. It's in the transactions that don't complete or that don't progress is where you can really find out what the obstacles were, what the needs are that aren't being met, and meet them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Look, at your background's been shaped by a very wide range of unique experiences, from growing up in Kosovo to your deep dive in fascination in psychology. How have these personal experiences influenced the way that you lead your team and approach client relationships today?
So I grew up in what is now was formerly called Yugoslavia, and I grew up in a very weird time in Yugoslavia where it was their last couple of years of being in existence. Honestly, I saw something that as an adult, I continued to learn from. I saw, 6 or 7 ethnicities that seemingly were very close to each other at the beginning of my childhood and was intermarried with each other, celebrated their holidays, celebrated their traditions into a full-on genocide across 2 different cities. And it always baffled me around how does that happen in a span of 2 years, which is very short, to go from praising celebrities for kind of crossing ethnic lines in terms of family creation and partnerships to deeming another party. And I recognize that this is getting to be a very morbid topic, but it was just so interesting to me because I remember the way my mom talked, and my mom still talks about Yugoslavia being like a very safe place to live and nobody really bothered you. And the cities just got along with each other. And that was a thing. There are problems to go to one of the most extreme levels that you could go into. And I think that perception was the key element around it. I did not start BMG because I was so in down with perception that I wanted to really research it. I did it because I worked for an incentive agency and I said, we want to understand how we incentivize people. We should learn about their psychology. And then they're like, cool, but we're not going to fund it. So I went and did it myself. It wasn't really until a few years later that I realized, oh, that's why that happened. Or I can see these elements start to piece together. And then as I grew up stateside, I went into data sciences in my early period because I'm an immigrant kid. And that's what you do. You go into a science and math field because starving artists aren't cool, as my mom likes to say. Pivoted back into the creative side because that's who I've always been. I definitely don't come from math and science were always easy, but they weren't necessarily interesting growing up. They were just things that I knew how to do. Now I get to do things that are very interesting and go back to the elements that I found very important, which is empathetic drives and like leading from a very humanistic mindset. Because I think that companies and organizations can make as much money as they want. But what's really important to me, and at an old CMO that I reported to who phrased it so well, and I still quote her, we are a company that makes money, but we are also responsible for the 3,000 people that we employ and their livelihood. And I take that with a very serious grain of salt, even when I help with my clients. And the way that I approach it is I am not just helping them make money. I'm helping them foster their team and drive a certain growth or launch a new drug that could help millions of people and some of those elements. So going back to the purpose of why we do things, and if you ask my mom what I do, she probably wouldn't be able to tell you transparently, but it's still a lot of fun to be able to be in this space and go back to the kind of human elements that I grew up on and fostering the things that I just believe in. And I think most people are honest and kind and so on, and they just maybe have a rough way of showing it. And that's my motto.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that's one of the reasons why we've got on so well over the years. And if not that, when you spoke about it takes a village. It takes a village. And when you're in an organization, and too often I see people that are sure you have to be focused on the profitability and ensuring that a business is sustainable and that it's growing. But you can't lose sight of the fact that you're also responsible. Those individuals that work for you, it's putting food on the family, on the table. It's feeding their family. It's educating their kids. It's educating it's supporting so many people beyond the individual that you speak to. They've got their greater responsibilities as well. And I think that if you have that as an underlying value set or awareness, that coupled with your natural curiosity, I think is something that just absolutely, it screams then this whole component of psychology. That for me is probably the great unknown. We talk about space and we've only explored 5% of the world's oceans. And I think there's less than 0.5% that we know really truly about the human brain, the human psychology. So thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. And not morbid, reality. People don't necessarily realize that everyone's got a story and on where they come from. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us here today.
Yeah, thank you. It's a story that apparently, yeah, if you asked me 5, 6 years ago, I probably wouldn't be able to share. It's only the last couple of years that I realized how important it is. And a friend of mine who's in early childhood development showed me like just how much impact those first few 10 years of your lives really make an impact on you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I can't imagine what it'd be like to be in that environment. My grandparents were actually met in a concentration camp, and my mother was born in a concentration camp in Germany and came to Australia when she was 3 years old with the family. So there's aspects I think that affect us all. Sometimes it's in the genetics and from the stories that you hear in your childhood as you're growing up, as not as much as the individual experience, but there's a level of awareness there, that's for sure. So again, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. Jumping topics slightly. With the rise, not exactly because it's still talking about the human side of things, but with the rise of AI and automation in marketing, how can brands ensure they still maintain a human touch in their campaigns and the results that they're delivering?
I have been actually seeing a really surprising number, and I'll use commercials because that's my main factor of let me see how things are going. Just some really unique ways to spin this through. And I think that AI, like all technology, is a great enabler. And in many instances, especially in smaller organizations, it's also a little bit of an equalizer. You could do things that you wouldn't have had the opportunity to because they would have been too costly, too hard to do, and so on. And the way that I think about it is the more human touch you can create, the better. How you bring that comes at every stage of a campaign or a program creation. It's who's generating the idea? Is it who is the deciding factor? What is the criteria? What are those elements? I'll use it to the equivalent of CGI because it's a good way of how it should not be done. I was watching Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm like, oh my God, this was like amazing. And that was 15 years ago or some really long number when the first movie came out. And then I saw a show that was fairly recent, 2020 or so, and it also used CGI. I'm like, but they're using the same technology, but the quality is drastically lower just from a visual perspective. And I heard a colleague of mine who's a videographer say that's because the technology has overtaken the time that the technology has become more important than the human using the technology. That was the critical factor. And I think that's a really good way to view AI. If you don't give humans enough time to iterate and play with, which is what happens in CGI, is rather than offer the opportunity for post-production to really fine-tune those elements and get the detail really right. It's very much an art form as much as it is as a technical skill. You lose the effect, in this case, literally. And I think AI is very similar. You can quite easily ask ChatGPT or Claude or whoever to give you 15 different social media posts. They're going to be the same as another company that asks for 15 social media posts. It's the human component that would make it really interesting. And that goes in every stage. There's just some really cool things that you can do. And it should be seen as a door opener, not an automator in my thought process. There's automation for other things. For God's sakes, please figure out a better way for me to steam dry my clothes. That would be nice. That would be amazing. And put a creativity back into people, because I think that's actually where the human touch is going to play.
I think Elon's in the process of building robots, housekeeping robots, isn't he?
That'd be great. I'll be the first buyer.
It's interesting. We've toyed around with a lot of AI in our business. One of the things, obviously, as a live chat service and a human-based live chat service, the question always comes up: what about AI chatbots and so forth? And they have a place. There's no doubt about that. We and I obviously speak to our customers to find out whether there's a desire to move to something that's more AI based, and it's a pretty resounding no at this stage. They're playing around with different things as well. But the reason that they've engaged us is because they want that human connection, talking to their prospects at that stage of the buying process. And live chat is one of those things that you are engaging very early and also very late. It's when they come to first do their initial research and part of the dark social and be anonymous. But it's also at the stage where they're ready to reach out and take the next steps as well. That human component in there is I believe, important, and our clients do as well, obviously. The AI that we're playing around with, and one of the things I'm looking at the moment is potentially using AI to create videos. I hate doing videos. I hate social media, full stop. And I looked at it and thought, if it's a human message, but it's coming from AI, an AI avatar or something along those lines, I wonder if the fact that it's an AI avatar, does that remove from the message, or will it be enough of a uniqueness to actually capture attention so that people do hear what's being said? What's your thoughts on that?
So we haven't done a ton on avatar replacements, but one of the ones that we did do is stock photos. And we have a lot of research around this, that it's much easier for you to put an animated photo versus a stock photo, because a stock photo is so generic that in the human mind, it basically reads as blank. I think that the avatar, there's a quality question around, like, how human is it going to be? Can it pass the uncanny value barrier, those kind of things around it. And then there's how much does that look like Terry, and how much does it, sound like Terry, or build that emotional connection around it. I think voice is getting pretty close from that. That made some really good stride. I think if you use an avatar, you have to decide what element of it, but it's an area that I'm a big late 90s, early 2000s, like those high tech sci-fi shows, or like Minority Report and some of those. So I look at it, I'm like, how close is this to what they imagine? Because I think areas those would be cool. Not my Minority Report for obvious reasons, but that's one of those that I think would be interesting. And it might be like an interesting nostalgia play if you can tie it to something that is much more emotionally connected, like a TV show or what have you. And might be a good spin on that. Something that's very new, but plays on something that's old and classic.
Interesting. It's interesting. And there's so many options these days. You could even upload a couple of photos of yourself, and it will actually, you do your voice in there. That AI takes on your voice, and it will turn your photo into a live video as well. The things that are capable of doing these days are mind-boggling, quite frankly. We're mucking around with all that sort of stuff, but and the same with the AI chatbot components on the front end. We're doing a little bit of work with that, but it's not on the surface. It looks great. Have chat with ChatGPT, but when you're digging down into specific questions about specific products and problems and concerns that people have got, and you're talking about 5, 6, 7-figure deals, that potential on the other side of this. We've been doing live chat for a decade now, so we've got in terms of conversations and data to teach, we've got more than enough. Still, I'm not able to get an LLM to a situation where I'd feel confident in letting it sit there and have a conversation unsupervised without having one of our team members beside it. It's just, maybe that's just me, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. I'm inclined to agree, at least with where technology is today. And I think the bigger element is that rapport building that you would have. And being able to tell a joke that lands, which requires a lot of taste that we know technology doesn't have. That's a human thing, right? Um, and I think that there's so many layers of what makes human that it's much harder for you to replicate. And I think then you have to go back to purpose. If you're going to use, in this scenario, social media postings, you could probably create a narrative around it and a story around it and then do it justice. With that way, it doesn't incur on your own personal time, but you should have these human element touch points because they become much more valuable at the end of the day. And I think actually when we think about concierge service that could be automated or what have you from People X or whatever the next company Elon Musk creates is going to be called, then that would be interesting just to say, do people spend more if they have a human concierge instead of a robot? Or some of those things to take into consideration. But it's just such an interesting time to see what technology kind of drives and how we put humans at the forefront. And I say that as we're talking about Blue Zone and some of these other elements where technology can be such a great enabler and solution provider for those. But at the end of the day, the people that have to make the decision to do that X, Y, and Z, even if the technology can get you 90% of the way there.
I'm reading a fascinating book at the moment called Alchemy by Rory Sutherland. And one of the stories he tells in there is that this whole concept of providing better service and managing costs within an organization, hotels went through a stage of getting rid of the bellhops, the doormen, and putting in automatic doors, automatic revolving doors or automatic sliding doors. And they thought this is going to be much more efficient. People can come through. But what they didn't factor in was the added value, the perceived value of the patrons by having that bellhop there, whether it's the prestige of having another person open the door for them, whether it's the dopamine hit you get when somebody recognizes you and calls you by your name as you're walking in there, versus somebody that's watching what's going on and just understanding what's happening to give you insights to the organization. It's not always as it seems on the surface when you're looking at what you might think is the right way to solve a problem is in fact quite counterintuitive to the real problems that are actually being solved. It wasn't about opening the door. It was about all the other aspects that go along with having a
emotional.
dominant.
Yeah, it's that emotional connection that you've built. And to your point, that separates the Ritz-Carltons from the Homewood Suites or some of these other different types of organizations that go in. And if you are looking for the hospitality space is a wonderful space to actually look at if you're thinking about how AI to be used and so on, because they do a ton of testing and they get exposure on both consumer and business. And most of their tactics actually end up being more consumer flavored, which I know you and I have talked about in the past is B2C is looking a lot more robust in this kind of age than B2B. B2B tends to be behind. And actually a lot of the things that B2B is adapting is things that have been tried for decades in the consumer world.
And look, I've actually mentioned this before, the research that we did across 5,006 websites. The insights that we gained there in terms of how far ahead e-commerce or B2C consumer marketing is in terms of the user experience in that buying process. And sure, they're heading somebody towards a checkout. So, they're motivated because it's immediate consequences that those marketers are going to see versus the, future uncertain consequences that marketers in B2B see because their outcome is a lead into a pipeline that may or may not be qualified. And so in terms of the actual real dopamine hit, which is the revenue at the other end of it, it's so far into the future and so uncertain. I don't think that there's necessarily, in some cases, I don't think there's the motivation to deliver the type of experience that e-commerce or the consumer brands deliver for B2B, for their clients in B2B. But the reality is it's still people. If you could deliver an e-commerce type experience to a B2B buying experience, I think that you would absolutely set yourself miles ahead, worlds ahead of your competitors in the same space.
Yeah, I've worked with a handful of blended companies, meaning they sold in both markets. And compared to their competitors, they were not only stronger with their B2B and ARMs because of the user experience. Think about it. At the end of the day, those B2B buyers are also B2C buyers of just different things. So rating you, even though they know that this is a different buying experience, they're still rating you on where you fall. And if you fall short, then you fall short. So compared to somebody else. So there is something to be said about the consumer first mindset that CMOs in consumer brands, CPG, e-commerce, and how quickly they can pivot and turn around. That, to your point, B2B does not have that muscle. And I think it can actually be very critical to have because we all have access to information. Something I could buy off of a particular website for a business need, Vistaprint, some of these business needs, I could buy anywhere else. So what's the difference? It's the experience.
Absolutely. It is. It's the experience that is the difference. You've got the other factors as well, but it's the experience is the first impact. That's the very first impact. That's what everything else gets framed.
Yeah.
That's right.